Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop, all the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop, Virginia Politics. Tonight we are going to be talking about economics. Now, I'm your host, Bettina Lawton. If you have watched the show before, you have never seen me discuss economics, and there is a very good reason for that, since I have not really looked at that topic since I was in college, as I say, back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. But fortunately, I have with me tonight somebody who knows a whole lot about economics, and we're going to talk about the question a little differently. Not the, are you better today than you were 4 years ago, but will you be better under the Romney-Ryan plan or the Obama plans coming up in the future? And to do that, we're going to put some context on it. We're going to look at where did President Obama start? Where are we now? How did we get there? We're going to look at some of the proposals that have come out, and I think you're going to be surprised at some of the information. When I started preparing for the show and started reading some of the economic analyses of the various plans, I was very surprised. And so we're going to go through all of that, and in order to do it in a way that makes some sense, I have got with me tonight Christian Dorsey, who is with the Economic Policy Institute. Now, Christian has been there since 2008, and let me tell you exactly what he's responsible for. He is the Director of External and Government Affairs. He works to build grassroots awareness of economic policy matters, and with the goal of educating the public about what you can do, what's the facts, how do you advocate for yourself. So he's a great person on the topic that we're going to be covering tonight. So, Christian, thank you so much for coming on out here.
Thank you, Bettina, and thank you for the warm introduction.
Let me find out a little bit about the Economic Policy Institute. So what exactly does that do?
Well, we're one of DC's homegrown industries. We're a think tank, and we have employed a lot of scholars and a lot of people who are practitioners of economics, who are not just academic practitioners, but people who want to see economic policy oriented towards helping the working class, the middle class, develop and prosper and share in the prosperity that they create through their work and through their labor. So we create analyses, we do original research, and then we take that and try to get it out to people in the form of huge communications and dissemination operation. But we also want to influence policy, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. So my job walks in both spheres, where I talk and work directly with people, but also with policymakers to see that the conclusions and the findings that we arrive at, which are seen as credible by people who know a little bit about economics, to see that that makes its way into policy. And we've had some successes, but don't blame us. The reason that unemployment is so high, a lot of the things that we've advocated for have not yet become part of policy making in this country.
All right. And how big or how long has the Economic Policy Institute been around?
We just celebrated our quarter century, 25th anniversary last year. So we've been around for 25 years, and we have a staff of around 55 people with a large number of PhD economists and a huge support network of people who carry out the work. And not only are we based here in Washington doing national politics, we also have a state network that works in about 42 of the 50 states doing economic policy on the state level.
Excellent. So you've been around. You're not one of these newcomers to the block.
No.
When we say, well, what's the difference with this or that? You're like, well, gee, I've only been here for a few years. Can't really tell you.
No, we've been here for a while.
Good. Well, let's talk about deficits.
Yes.
Because I heard one time someone say, and it was some commentator who said, people don't understand deficits. It's not like, if you have your checkbook and you run out of money, that it's different. And so this sort of obsession with what's the number is really overblown.
Yeah,
so
it is.
What is that? What's the deficit in the context of the federal deficit that we're talking about? What does that really mean?
Well, deficits and debt, those are words that are English words, and we apply them in our regular lives, but it's not at all analogous, really, for a couple of key reasons. One, the government, unlike us, lives on. We're going to die. Hope that's not news to you, but we're going to die. Therefore, running deficits and debts that we cannot repay within our lifespan doesn't make any sense. That's a bad thing, because that leaves a burden to those who are heirs or are survivors. Not a good thing. However, governments are perpetual. They move on and on and on. So the first thing is you can't really think about them in the same way. And then the second piece, many people consider running a deficit of any kind to be just bad news. You shouldn't do that. Mm-hmm. It all depends on what your deficit is being accrued for. If you're at home and you're running up credit card balances on nights out at fancy restaurants, not a smart thing. However, if you are accruing debt to purchase a home, to invest in your education, which is going to provide the ability to generate even more income moving forward, those are wise ways to go into debt and to perhaps run deficits in your monthly account. And that's really what we look at with government. How is government spending the money, and is it responsible? And if government is doing so in a way that's going to invest, create economic growth, it's a very good thing. If government's just spending money that gets, siphoned out the window, that's clearly something else. And most people just look at the number without looking at what's behind it. And it's really critical when you look at governments to look at what's behind it.
Well, and the deficits come and go, because in 2000, at the end of the Clinton era,
yes,
there was this talk about all the surplus we
right,
had. We
right.
had huge numbers on the surplus. And then
well, we had a modest surplus, but if you projected out, those would grow and grow and grow, so that you could eventually have retired down the debt. Fact of the matter is, the country usually runs deficits. It's usually that we spend more than we bring in. That's a common occurrence. It's been for the better part of the last century. What you want is for your debts to be sustainable. That's a key term that you'll hear among economists. Make sure our debts are sustainable. Now, there's not universal agreement as to what sustainable means, but everybody who knows a little bit about this subject realizes debts are not the problem. It's just whether or not they're too much.
Okay. So we start out in 2000, and this is what I keep hearing. So you tell me if I'm all completely wrong on this. But we keep hearing how we had all these unfunded expenditures or changes. So you had the big Bush tax cuts in 2001, where the rates went down over the course of the year. They had a sunset provision because if you extended them out, it produced huge deficits.
Absolutely.
Nobody was going to vote for that,
right,
because they wouldn't get reelected, I assume,
exactly.
would be the reason. But then when it came time for them to actually sunset out and the rates to go back up, they did a little extension, but we're facing it again at the end of this year.
Right.
And then we had an unfunded off-budget war in Iraq, an unfunded off-budget war in Afghanistan. We had a drug benefit that went out to seniors that was not funded.
That's right.
And all of that I thought was kind of interesting, because it was during a Republican time frame, and the Republicans are always the ones who keep saying we're fiscal responsibility, and it's like, really, because you spent all of this money and we didn't actually have the money for it. And we ended up with this huge deficit. We had all the financial market manipulations with the Lehman Brothers failures and the AIGs and the derivatives and all the things that sort of these black box securities that they kept saying, trust us, it's fine, we know. And then it turned out, no, we don't know. Huge recession, housing market collapses, 800,000 people a month were losing their jobs when President Obama came in. Huge, heading straight into a massive recession, depression kind of scenario that we ended up not going into, and I think people forget that's where we were going.
Right.
So, as I understand it, one of the things that helped to pull that out was what's called the Stimulus Act, although it has an official name, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act.
Yeah.
And I read that there was $800 billion spent, $300 billion of it, back and forth, are tax cuts, which I always laugh when people say, well, all he's doing is raising taxes. And I'm like, well, we had $300 billion of tax cuts within the first year that he was elected. I'm not sure how that works. Infrastructure and education investments of $250 billion, and then $250 billion of sort of safety net stuff, the food stamps and low-income programs to help the folks who were really hardest hit.
Yeah.
So that was out there. People complained, well, then why didn't unemployment go down more?
Right, right.
And why aren't we in better shape today?
Right.
Because we had a stimulus. And so they've talked about it again, well, we need a second stimulus. People have said, no, we're not going to do that. It didn't work the first time. So from an economic sort of basis, why didn't it work the first time? What was
it did, and first of all, let me just say, that was a great recap of where we were and what was the environment when the president took office. The Recovery Act, the stimulus, however you want to describe it, was misunderstood, but it was also missold by the administration. This is something that they have to own. They did sell the idea that this was going to reverse what we were experiencing. Now, the reason that they oversold it was because at the time that the stimulus was drafted, we were at a certain level of pain. By the time the thing actually became legislation, we had reached a whole other level of pain that didn't factor into their analysis. So at the end of the day, what they thought was going to be what we call the output gap, fancy term for saying all of a sudden the recession was so big, the economy was producing a certain amount less than what it was capable of producing. Well, that gap was about $1.5 trillion. They were working under the assumption that it was going to be around $750 billion. So it was twice as bad as they thought. Therefore, the Recovery Act was half as effective as it needed to be. So the first thing, no kind of stimulus, no kind of program that's half as big as it needs to be is going to change a situation overnight. But what it did do, as you accurately described, it headed off the United States heading into a Great Depression 2.0. And it's amazing that here we are 4 years later, and I think people, once they start to think about this or stop to think about it, sort of get it. Wait a minute, the world was going to collapse economically. It never did. Why? Maybe it was that. Now, it didn't change and put us on the path to robust recovery. Absolutely not, but it couldn't. It wasn't big enough. But it did avoid us falling into the Great Depression 2.0, which is certainly an accomplishment. You remember those days from 2009. People were scared to death.
Right, exactly. And, the markets were in a free fall.
Absolutely.
Everybody was like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? And the whole crisis atmosphere that was going on in the fall was just amazing.
That's right. And we're all disappointed when we hear these monthly job numbers that are not quite as big as we would like them to be. But 150,000 jobs a month added, which has been the average for the last year and a half, a whole lot better than 800,000 a month lost.
Well, we're going to talk some more about this when we come back from our break. We're going to continue talking deficits, we're going to talk jobs, we're going to talk about economics. So stay with us, we will be right back.
Every year, 350,000 people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Who will be their caregivers?
I am a caregiver.
Yo soy la que cuida a mi abuelo.
I'm a caregiver.
Call 1-800-437-2423 for a free brochure from Alzheimer's Disease Research on caring for those you care for the most. 1-800-437-2423.
I'm a caregiver. Mom, you really look good.
Not long ago, Albert couldn't take long walks. He was diagnosed with a bad heart. After considering all the treatment options, his heart specialist recommended a pacemaker instead of putting him to sleep. Get the facts about animal research
to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm here with Christian Dorsey, and we're talking economics. And when we went to break, we were talking about the Stimulus Act and why it wasn't as effective as some people were hoping it would be. And I wanted to ask you, Christian, because I know last week, I think it was, maybe the week before, they failed to pass the Veterans Job Act, which I thought was absolutely deplorable, I might add. My son's a veteran, and while he's employed, I'm very sympathetic to the enormously high unemployment rate that veterans suffer, and the notion that they would refuse to pass it just so President Obama couldn't claim some kind of progress is just appalling. It just appalls me. But they also haven't passed the Regular Jobs Act. And one of the things that I was wondering, because we started hearing about recently again the riots in Greece and all the problems with the countries that thought they would deal with their problems through these austerity programs. Is that what we are looking at if we keep going down this road of saying we're not going to spend any money, we're not going to invest in jobs or infrastructure? Are we looking at something like that, or is there something that would say, oh no, we are immune from that kind of?
No, that's exactly right. We've been under a de facto austerity regime since 2010. When the Congress changed over and Mitch McConnell got a chance to actually see realized his goal of trying to make President Obama a one-term president by not giving him any sort of legislative victory. And what we've seen is every initiative, whether it be the Veterans Jobs Bill, whether it be the President's American Jobs Plan, whether it be minor, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, judicial appointments. They have refused to allow the president to really see his agenda put forward. And what I find ironic is now we have a campaign that's all about what the president's done, and you've got a party that's pretty much prevented him from putting his agenda into play. So it's really a dishonest campaign from everything that you hear. And economically speaking, the danger is you have to spend in order to grow. It may seem paradoxical to people, but let's think about it this way. When you've got people who, because their incomes haven't grown, are not spending in the economy. You've got businesses because they don't know if they're customers for their goods and services who are not investing. There's only one other actor in the economy, government. And if government shrinks, then what do you have? You have all three shrinking at the same time. That's recession. And if they shrink big enough, that's depression. So what you need when two of the three are not working is for the other to step up. And government can step up and spend right now at virtually at no cost because interest rates are next to nothing. And we have a huge amount of work that can be done, whether it be infrastructure, energy development, a huge amount of work that can be done. And if government is not doing that work, we're missing a huge opportunity. And as we see from Greece, we see in Ireland before that, we see in the United Kingdom, austerity is not the path to prosperity. Austerity doesn't work. Austerity may get people elected, but it actually takes countries down the drain.
Well, let's talk about the job proposals, because President Obama has a budget plan that has job proposals in it. And now, Ryan has a plan that he put out. Romney, I always hear it as the Ryan-Romney plan, although I guess Romney would prefer to be Romney-Ryan, based on his performance the other day, wherever he was, where he tried to get them to chant Romney-Ryan instead of Ryan. That was really pathetic. Does Romney, first of all, does Romney have a separate proposal on jobs? Is it unfair to tag him with the Ryan plan?
Well, he's got an economic plan, but, let's be frank about this. Paul Ryan, for those people who haven't followed his legislative career, he's the chairman of the House Budget Committee. He's the Republicans, he's their policy wonk on the budget. If you're not going to adopt his plan, why in the world did you ask him to be vice president? It's not like he's got bona fides in foreign policy, not like he's got any other thing to recommend him other than his work on the budget. So, in effect, since Ryan has been very specific about his budget plans and Romney has mostly kept it to platitudes and sound bites, I think it's absolutely fair to associate him with the Ryan plan because, there's just no other reason that you'd ask Paul Ryan to be your VP pick.
Although, on that for just a moment to divert, I thought that the job creation, the economy, finance, was supposed to be Romney's forte. He has no foreign policy experience either.
No, that's true. Absolutely.
So I was looking, and people say, well, neither did Obama, but he got Biden, who'd been head of Foreign Relations Committee forever, actually knew something. I was a little surprised. It was sort of like, if that's your strong suit, then why are you picking this young guy? It's not like he's from some great state with a bazillion followers, you know. I mean, not to diss his state or anything, but still. I did think that was kind of odd for someone who, at the time, was promoting himself as a great job creator. And so that hasn't been working well for him, I know.
Exactly.
Well, let's look at the plans, because under the Obama plan, there's the American Jobs Act. So in the short term, what does that do? Is that going to create jobs? Is that not? Is this all smoke and mirrors? What is it?
Yeah, the American Jobs Act that President Obama offered, you know, now over a year ago is, a little over a year ago now at this point, would add over the course of the year about 2 million jobs to the economy. Not enough to, you know, get rid of the backlog of you know, the 12 million who are unemployed, but certainly enough to make a significant difference and to lower the unemployment rate. I'd like to see the president get a lot bolder in terms of his jobs initiatives. I recognize that he's sensitive to deficit issues, but you know, no real economist could argue that getting America back to work, significantly lowering the unemployment rate, and then having all of that economic activity translate into spending and tax dollars, that's the best way to grow the American economy and to reduce the deficit at the same time. Really, it's job one is to get people back to work. So I'd like to see the president even go farther. But his jobs plan stands in stark contrast to Romney-Ryan, who both want to cut significantly federal spending right away, the minute they walk in the door, which is to cement what has been the de facto austerity that we've had for the last year and a half. They want to actually, you know, put it in legislative stone, which would immediately put this economy at risk in going into recession again. And you know, think about how devastating that would be for this economy to go into another recession before it's really had a robust recovery.
Well, I had read that depending on how they would fund these cuts and the tax cuts they want and all of this, that we could be looking at several million jobs lost in the next couple of years.
It's quite potential. You know, I hate to put a number on it because we have to have specific proposals to put specific jobs numbers on them, and they have been very careful not to be very specific at all, which I don't recommend that. That's not a good thing for civic discourse, that you're trying to ask the American people to elect you to the highest office in the land, and yet you don't want to provide any details about what you offer. That's, to me, it's shameful from a civic perspective. But it also makes it very difficult to say with certainty they're going to cost this many jobs because they haven't been specific enough. But from what I can analyze and from what I can see, there's no way they're going to grow any jobs. I can certainly say that with absolute comfort. From everything that we see, the math only adds up to, you know, job losses that could be, you know, only a few 100,000 in the first year, or it could be as bad as a couple of million, depending on what they actually would do. Well, that kind of puts a lie to this "we're the job creators" mantra that they keep running on. Well, that's misguided, really, from the get-go. This whole idea that wealth creates jobs is just a complete fallacy. Jobs are the function of economic activity that have many players involved at the same time. I don't care how wealthy you are. No one who is sitting on lots of wealth wants to create a job if there are no customers for the goods and services. Customers for goods and services come from a very broad and growing middle class, working class, and if that's not happening, then nobody's gonna create a job for anybody. And you can't even really look at it that way. A business doesn't create a job to be benevolent. They do it because it's going to be an efficient way to actually make profit, right? So it's economic activity that creates jobs. And if you try to shortchange economic activity, then you're shortchanging job creation. But you know, the Republican ideology that it's wealthy people who create jobs is just, it's offensive and it's wrong.
Well, is that partly what I've also heard, where they say if you give a tax cut to a wealthy person. You don't generate the same level of economic activity as if you give it to a poorer person or a middle-class person. That the wealthy person doesn't need extra money in their pocket, they've got a lot of it already, versus somebody who is not as well off is going to go out and say, I need to finally replace that old clunker, I need to get a new heating system, winter's coming, those types of things. And so you're more likely to have a turnover of that money.
That's right. Not more likely. This is empirically proven with research. And it also, you don't need research to tell you this. It just makes absolute sense. If you've got more money than you can actually spend, well, what do you do if someone drops more money into your lap? You know, you may stick it in a bank account, you may sock it in a mattress, you may invest it in a company. But, you know, again, when you invest it in a company that's disproportionately paying its CEOs much more than its workers or much more than it's investing in projects, you're just circulating money among people who already have too much money. Therefore, it does not get spent in the economy, whereas the same dollars going to someone who's living paycheck to paycheck or having difficulty making ends meet, all that money goes out the door in the form of new economic activity, new goods and services, and that creates jobs. That's what creates jobs.
Now, I also read somewhere in getting ready for tonight's show that the budget proposals under President Obama in the next year would increase the deficit a little bit. But then when you got into the out years and the economic activity was picking up and the jobs had been created, the deficit goes back down. As opposed to under the Ryan plan, I think it was specifically his plan that he'd put out a year or so ago, the deficits continue to go up.
That's right.
Every year.
Until, you know, 2030.
So, okay, so they're not job creators apparently.
That's
and they also are not deficit reducers?
No. So what are they?
So what are they? Yeah, that was the next question. So what are they then? I mean, that's their wheelhouse. That's what they keep saying to everybody. But
you know, it's been a long time since in school we used to come up with you know, synonyms and other ways of describing things. So, you know, we'll put it to the people who are watching it. What would you say are people who say they are one thing and whose plans achieve something quite different? What would you say about people who claim to be fiscally responsible and concerned about future generations and yet, you know, run deficits for future generations? You know, many people would say that that's fraudulent and would call them frauds.
that's absolutely true. And my psychologist friends would call it something else, but I'm not a psychologist, so I can't give you the actual diagnosis of people.
Show, right?
Delusional, I think, would be one of the phrases. But anyway, stay with us. We've got some more to talk about when we come back.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Wanted some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try.
Only you.
Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rigged off money. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Yeah.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
Why don't you just wash your car at home?
When I wash my car, everything runs down the street and down into the storm drains. With all the chemicals in the soaps and waxes, the last thing I want to do is poison my own drinking water.
At least here, it's all contained and recycled on site.
That's why I also take my car in for oil changes instead of doing it myself. I might take a chance on spilling stuff.
You know what the best part is?
What?
More time to kick back and watch the game.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow!
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
Somewhere around the world, there are men and women of the armed forces risking their lives, helping rebuild communities after natural disasters, collecting toys for needy children, tutoring kids in school. These are your sons and daughters who work to keep us safe, secure, and free. Dedicated men and women who put their country first.
We're to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
I'm Bettina Lawton. I'm your host. I have Christian Dorsey with me tonight of the Economic Policy Institute, and we are talking economics and some politics with Obama and the Ryan-Romney plans. And when we left, we were talking about not really being a job creator, not really being a deficit, fiscally conservative person or team or plan. So we have some problems with what they're advertising. Maybe we could get the Federal Trade Commission. I think they have a deceptive advertising section.
Well, they'd be busy this season.
They'd be very busy. And I'm sure the folks on the Republican side would be saying, yes, they'd be going after all those awful Democrats. I did want to mention one other thing. I read something about this balanced budget amendment that Ryan and Romney are pushing.
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of interesting in a way, because it's an attempt, as I understand this, to amend the Constitution to say that Congress has to pass balanced budgets.
Yeah.
And I heard it described in something that Romney put out, saying that this is to promote long-term fiscal discipline. And there was going to be a supermajority provision so that if you wanted to raise taxes, a supermajority of that Congress had to vote for it.
Yeah.
Which I found the concept a little crazy, because you can't say we're going to always balance the budget unless you are forevermore going to do your wars off budget.
Yeah.
How does that work? It struck me as incredibly sort of pie in the sky. You don't really understand how this whole thing works, and it just didn't strike me as a good idea.
Well, they do want to keep the wars off budget, and they do have a provision usually in the balanced budget plans that allows them to basically suspend those rules in the event of national emergency, is usually the way it's described. But, your initial instinct is exactly right. There are many reasons why Congress may choose to run a deficit in any given year that are completely not only valid, but productive and necessary. To hamstring the Congress into actually reaching higher and higher procedural hurdles in order to do its business would be absolutely irresponsible. We see how difficult it is for Congress to go about doing its regular business right now. You want to add more procedural hurdles to what they have to do? It's completely laughable. And it's based on a faulty supposition that an unbalanced budget in any given year is a bad thing. If we didn't run deficits over the last 2 years, this country would be in the depths of a depression, the likes of which we could not see ourselves getting out of. This whole idea that if government had been mandated to balance its budget, what would it have looked like if there had been no aid to the states here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, which allowed Virginia to actually maintain modest economic growth throughout the recession? That would not have been possible if the federal government was not able to provide aid to the states in the form of providing people help with health care and nutrition assistance and all the rest. If not for the incredible amount of federal economic activity going on in this Northern Virginia region, the engine of this state would not have been an engine of anything positive over the last few years, which would have been disastrous downstate. So to believe that this would be good policy, that this would be responsible, fortunately, most serious people in Congress in Washington know that the balanced budget amendment is just a talking point gimmick and that no one's really serious about. But that goes back to what we were saying before. They're frauds because they're selling you a bill of goods that they absolutely have no interest in pursuing.
Well, and the talking point idea worries me in the sense that the whole Grover Norquist no tax pledge was a gimmick. And all these people signed on to it. Although I now see some folks saying, thankfully, my allegiance is to the American people, not Grover Norquist. Now,
finally.
The fact that, yes, finally, the fact that it took you years to figure this out, that pledging your support to a lobbyist, which people act like he's some great whatever, the man is a lobbyist, for heaven's sakes.
Absolutely.
And so we have legislators, if they pledge their allegiance to the ACLU, I'm sure people would have a problem.
Oh, Darrell Issa would be having hearings calling people traitors, right? Wouldn't they?
Yes, they would. You know they would.
Because they take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. against all enemies, foreign and domestic, but you know, you have an allegiance to a lobbyist that supersedes your allegiance to everyone else. It's laughable.
Makes no sense. So I worry about things like balanced budget amendments, and then you've got to rely on the states, if the Congress were crazy enough to pass it, to not ratify it. And people forget, and I think the point that you made about what would the states have done. I have heard so many people say, well, Virginia has to have a balanced budget. It's like, yes, and how many hundreds of millions of dollars did Virginia get from the stimulus, which really amazes me, because the Republicans down in Richmond and Governor McDonnell talk about how horrible the stimulus was. At the same time, they got their hand out to get it. Because it saved a ton of teacher positions, firefighters, police, all of these people that we would have had to lay off if we didn't get that stimulus money in. So people need to be a little bit more aware of where this money to balance the Virginia budget is coming from. Because that just annoys me, as you can tell, because I just got annoyed again when I thought about it.
No, it's, you know, it's an amazing thing, and you know, people talk about the, you know, the Recovery Act, and you know, some of it, it's just so elementary in its brilliance. You know, if you prevent you know, huge numbers of employees from being laid off, that means that they continue to provide tax money to the state, even despite the private sector layoffs that are going on. If you can keep those public sector employees on the job, you are able to return payroll, which is helping states like Virginia, and there are a few others that actually weathered the recession pretty well. Without that, they would have been in the category of states that were battered and hammered, and you know, that governors or other elected officials have not been honest about that is shameful.
Well, let me ask you just a little bit about, because as on my way over here I was listening to the radio and they were talking about sequestration and how Virginia is going to be battered if,
it will be.
if we don't get something done about this. And I always say to folks, you know, elections have consequences, and you need to go and you need to vote, and then you need to not just vote for the president, you need to vote for the senators, you need to vote for your Congress people. And in Northern Virginia, we have mostly Democratic Congress folks, except for Frank Wolf in the 10th, who many people do not remember. I remember when Frank Wolf originally ran 32 years ago. And one of the big planks in his platform was term limits. So I am waiting to see, because apparently 32 years later, we have not hit that limit.
Right?
Hopefully we're going to hit his limit soon, because that would be wonderful to have a Democrat in. I think we need, if we're going to get some rationality back, we need to change the players who are there, people who have not taken these pledges, who are willing to consider how do you close gaps, how do you increase the productivity of the economic activity in this country.
That's right.
And if you take, and you hear Tim Kaine, who's obviously running for Senate in Virginia, talk about it. If you try and balance a budget by simply cutting, you cannot do it.
That's right.
His position is that in the federal budget context, that it's too massive. You can't realistically cut enough to balance it without destroying our economy. You can't do it and leave the Pentagon alone, which they say they're going to do, but it doesn't seem it's going to be realistic.
Right. Well, you can. It's our budget is made up, you know, and this is another way where the household analogy doesn't make sense. You know, the household budget analogy usually presumes that your income stays the same and you just cut your expenses, and that's how you make any deficits come into line. Well, that makes sense in a household. Federal government, the income, the revenue, is dependent on spending in many ways. So if you absolutely reduce the spending, that reduces your ability to actually generate revenue, because much of that spending supports jobs. Jobs produce taxes. Without those tax revenues, you know, you're in this vicious spiral where you're cutting, but you're receiving less, cutting, receiving less, and therefore your deficits remain the same, but you've basically made a lot of people live through absolute undescribable pain.
So it makes no sense at all.
It just doesn't. It just doesn't. And you know, I think people, once they hear this, once they think about it, they get it. It's not a hard sell. But that's why you have a party that's very much into just keeping it on this very superficial, platitudinous level, so that you just don't think about it for a minute. You know, people hear that, okay, we need to live within our means, and that makes sense to them.
Right.
But you know, they don't give you the next sentence, which says, well, what I'm proposing actually doesn't help us live within our means. It just puts debt in a different box.
Well, let's talk a little bit, and you mentioned at one point before we went to break the last time about CEO compensation. And I wanted to talk about that because there was an inequality that has gone on, and you sent me some slides, and I want to go to this first slide because it's a 30-year slide. So we're going to see if we can get the folks in the control room to actually pay attention to me. And it may not happen to get my slide
They've
up.
got it up
They
there.
got
It's
it up.
beautiful.
There
It's
they
beautiful.
go.
Look at that.
All
It looks
right.
beautiful, doesn't it?
It looks beautiful, and it's in blue. So tell the viewers what this is, because this is it's a 30-year household income growth.
Yeah.
So what does that show us?
So Bettina, this looks at, if you imagine all of the income growth that we have in this country, the amount that we have more in national income in 2007 than in 1979, if you choose to make that into a pie and see who got the slices, what it would look like is this. The top 1% got more pie than the bottom 90% combined. So that top 1% that's in that dark blue big chunk, they got more than all of those little slivers on the right side of the pie chart that go up to the 90th percentile. So in other words, the top 1% got more pie than 90% of the population in the United States. That's income inequality at its most clear. So when people talk about why in the world would you just want to increase taxes on the rich, that's where the money is. Not to be crass, why would you, where else are you going to increase taxes? You tax the people who've made all the money. And it's not a matter of being punitive, it's a matter of being just policy correct. That's where the growth has come. That's where the sacrifice needs to come from.
Well, now, there was a commercial that the Republicans put out. I think it was put out by one of their super PACs, the Karl Rove folks, about redistribution of income. And they talked about that and said President Obama was in favor of that.
Yes.
So when we come back, we're going to talk about this in the context of the Romney-Ryan plan, because it seems to me that that's what they're doing. They're redistributing income, but the other way.
Upwards. Yes.
So stay with us, because we are going to talk about that when we come back for our final segment.
Saving for retirement might be easy for some folks, but for others, it might take a little more work. And for those who haven't started, there are still things you can do to catch up.
Oh, that is good news.
Like getting out from underneath past debt. And don't get wrapped up with high-interest credit cards.
Get you some eyes.
Be diversified with your investments. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Your financial goals are not out of reach. The choice is clear. For a happy ending, choose to save.
Everyone with alcohol and drug addiction is in the same boat. With treatment, you can find solid ground. For drug and alcohol information and treatment referral for you or someone you know, call 1-800-662-HELP.
Dude, are you sure you want this tattoo? Because just do it.
Some mistakes in life are permanent. Like hearing loss. To learn how to protect your hearing, visit asha.org.
You've probably heard about heart disease, but did you know that it's the #1 killer of women nationwide? Heart disease claims more lives each year than breast cancer, lung cancer, or strokes combined. But there are steps you can take to protect yourself against it. For more information on how you can prevent heart disease, contact your local American Heart Association or visit their website at www.americanheart.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back. I'm Bettina Lawton, your host, and I have Christian Dorsey of the Economic Policy Institute, and we are talking about economics. We are talking about income redistribution, which is where we left off the last segment, so we're going to pick it up there. And I want to show another chart because I've got it up, and we're going to do it. And if, Christian, if you can tell us what this is,
sure,
that would be great, because obviously we've got this massive line. It went way up.
Well, we're looking at here, Bettina, this is a comparison of what CEOs made compared to the average workers who work for them in 1965 and various points in time going up to 2011. And the important things to just look at here, in 1965, the CEOs made around 20 times as much as their typical worker.
Okay.
2011, that's 10 times worse in favor of the CEO. They're making about more than 200 times what their typical workers are making. And you see some of those big peaks over the course of the last 20 years. You know, we have the stock market peak in 2000, and it got up as high as 400 to 1. But what we see very clearly is that from 1965 until the mid-1980s, CEOs didn't make exorbitant pay compared to their workers. And when you hear often Republicans talking about wanting to take us back to those good old days, well, this is one place where I wish they would, where we could actually get back to the days where CEOs made something that was substantially more than their workers, but not obscene, like 200 times what workers make. And when you talk about wanting to further cut taxes on the CEO class, what you are in effect doing is taking the wealth and productivity that is created by the middle class, and you are redistributing it upwards to people who are making so much more than their cohorts made a generation ago.
Well, and I thought that was kind of the redistribution of income, and there is a report that says if you look at what the Ryan tax plan is, that it would increase taxes on people making between $20,000 and $200,000.
Right.
But then it would give over a $500,000 tax cut to the millionaires.
That's right. That's right.
And to me, I read that and I was like, well, I think that's redistributing income.
Big time.
It's just, as we said before the break, it's the other way.
Right.
It's taking it from the poor and giving it to the rich. And apparently that system is okay for redistributing the income.
Yeah, and to be fair, Ryan and Romney are not claiming that they want to raise taxes on lower middle class folks. They say their plan won't, but anyone who's done the math, you know, you heard that line during the Democratic convention.
Right?
You know, if you do the arithmetic, there's no other conclusion to reach if they're actually going to, you know, what they do is they get very specific about the tax cuts they do at the high end, and then they say that they're going to make it up. You know, we don't know how, but we're going to make it up so that we don't increase the tax burden on the middle class. Well, you can't do that. You can't just generate money out of nowhere. So that's where it comes from, that they're actually going to be, in effect, proposing a $2,000 tax on the lower middle class. That's what happens when you do the arithmetic. But that's wealth redistribution. You know, it's different in the sense that the Republicans like to talk about taking money from wealthy people and redistributing it. But what in effect has been going on for 30 plus years is that the collective wealth of the bottom 99% has been going to increase the incomes of the top 1%. How ridiculous is that?
Well, it sort of goes along with this notion that, which I just found so amazingly offensive, this notion that if they built it, it was on their own endeavors.
Right.
And their we built it theory, as opposed to recognizing that, for example, the CEO, you may be sitting up there and you may be dealing with budgets and plotting things and doing stuff and even being creative and, you know, all this great thing. But, you know, it's like Steve Jobs, rest his soul, didn't physically go out and make
That's right.
the computer, didn't make the iPhone. If you didn't have those people who were doing it themselves, if you didn't have the people who drove the trucks, the people who built the roads, which a lot of those roads are built with government money.
Absolutely.
If you didn't have the education system, the public education system to educate your workers, you can have all the great ideas you want.
A patent system which protects your ideas from somebody else stealing them. So many things that, you know, once you drill down, absolutely.
And that to me was just like, you know, let's get some reality going here. You take away all of those workers who are making 1/200th of what you're making.
Right.
And you're not going to be making that anymore.
That's right.
And there seems to be a complete disconnect with the folks that Romney is appealing to and the reality. And it's sort of astounding to me that this disconnect exists in this day and age, that he doesn't have better advisors, because it certainly is, his life experience is not such that he personally understands this, from what I understand. Although I thought it was very interesting that his mother, there was a film of his mother, I don't know if you saw
Fascinating.
it.
It was
saying
fascinating,
that his father took welfare.
Yeah, use that word. So,
Took that, yes. He came up out of Mexico where they were living, and he had welfare, and that when, so when Romney was younger, the family was actually on welfare, but he'd like to cut that for everybody else, because he got his.
That's right.
So he doesn't need to give it to anybody else anymore. Let's also talk, the other thing that I saw was the effect that the tax plan would have on people like Romney. That's how it was phrased, like Romney. People who make their income from capital gains. So they own stock, the stock appreciates, it's capital gains. Or they get dividends. The company makes money, they pay it out on a per share basis in dividends, and then something called carried interest. And that they propose to either reduce that or bring the tax rate on those to zero. So that effectively anybody who relies on that doesn't pay any taxes.
That's right, yeah. So Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan's, the iteration of Paul Ryan's plan would have given his boss, would have reduced his tax burden from around 13% to almost zero under Paul Ryan's plan, because Mitt Romney, even though it's called work, what he did at Bain Capital, it's taxed at a completely different rate from the work that I do at the Economic Policy Institute, or someone who's working as a school teacher or working as a doctor. Completely different. We're taxed at the ordinary income tax rates. His is capped at 15%, and Paul Ryan says, you know what, that's still too much. I'd like to take it down even further. And you know, with the ability of people in that CEO class to increasingly decide on their own initiative whether or not they're paid in capital income versus ordinary labor income, just think about the implications of that. You just further allow people who are now 211 times what their average worker is making the ability to actually grow that even more after taxes, because of how in effect they're paid, where their workers don't have that same choice.
And so all those folks out there who are getting their W-2 income, I guess is what the earned income, you're getting that pay stub and it shows the deductions out for your taxes and your Social Security. You see those big tax numbers come out. That their plan isn't going to help you.
Not going to help you at all.
Well, and the other interesting thing that I saw recently, because people were talking about the stock market and how when Obama started, it had fallen to about 6,500. The Dow Jones was down to 6,500. And I checked before I came in today, it closed well over 13,000.
Right.
And I thought, well, you know, why don't people feel richer? I mean, your stocks are doing better. A lot of the housing market has recovered. It may not have recovered fully, but it's not in a free fall anymore. And then I saw a statistic that said the top 1% in this country own over a third of all the stock.
That's right.
And that the top 20% of households own 90% of the stock wealth, which is sort of similar to what you were saying about the income distribution over the last 20 years and the imbalance in that. It's like the folks who would really benefit from this favored tax treatment on dividends and capital gains are limited really to the top 20% of the country, and the rest of the people get no benefit at all.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing that so much attention is paid to what's going on in, you know, the New York Stock Exchange, and you know, every newscast leads with it. You've got Fox with the Business Channel, CNBC, where basically all they do is cover the markets and the floor from open until close. And the vast majority of the American public has no skin in that game. Right. Matters not a whit to them what goes on. 13.5, 60. It does matter in terms of, you know, opportunities, et cetera, but you know what I mean.
Right.
Direct skin in the game,
none.
Nothing at all. And it's just another fact of the imbalance of American life right now.
Right.
Which does make you wonder why the CEO class seems to be so resistant to the Obama regime, given that it's produced such dramatic income growth in the corporate sector in the last few years, particularly when we wondered whether we'd have a corporate sector at all.
Right. Well, someone pointed out to me one day that if you look at the amount of money lost in the mortgage industry, the homeowners who lost a lot of money, there's about $2 trillion that are gone. And they said, you know, the Republicans always say the money doesn't disappear at some place, and it is. But it's the $2 trillion in cash that corporate America has sitting in its treasuries, not spending.
That's right.
So we talk about government not spending, but the corporate people aren't spending either. So again, as you say, if you've only got a certain number of players and some of them won't play, the government has got to step in order to loosen that up and get it going.
Well, and you know, and the reason why the corporate sector isn't playing, unfortunately, it's because, you know, they look at politics and they see, you know, through their incredible influence that if they get a Romney-Ryan plan, maybe there is that possibility that we could see capital gains taxes reduced to zero. So they sit on cash, waiting for the next administration, where in effect they're, you know, they should be involved in economic activity for the good of the country. They're not, and our system allows that, which is a big problem.
Right, it is. Well, I want to touch, we've only got a couple of minutes, actually 1 minute left, so I do want to talk about voucher care, which is what I understand they want to turn Medicare into.
Yeah.
And I heard Tim Kaine talk about this morning, and he said, you know, what they're really talking about is saying, here's your voucher for a certain amount of money. If you go beyond that in what you need for medical care, go out and buy it in the private market.
Right.
And Medicare, I saw one study said it's at least 11% cheaper than if you had to go and buy it in the market.
That's a low estimate, yeah.
But then it's up to you.
Right.
So the sick, the vulnerable, the old are the ones who get tagged again.
The Republican health care plan is not to do anything about the escalating rate of health care costs. It's just to cap the amount of money that the federal government spends and leave you on your own. Consequences be darned.
All right, folks, remember, if you've heard it here before, elections have consequences. Please go out and vote November 6th.